Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Laura Laurent, and on this week, we have the pleasure of speaking with Yaroslav Trofimov, who is the chief foreign affairs correspondent of the Wall Street Journal, covering major issues and developments around the world. He is also author of Our Enemies Will Vanish, The Russian Invasion and Ukraine's War of Independence, which is our topic of today's conversation. Yaroslav won the National Press Club Award for Political Analysis in 2024 and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize both in 2023 for his coverage of the war in Ukraine and in 2022 for his coverage of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. He is a native of Ukraine and a graduate of New York University, and he joined the Wall Street Journal in 1999 and previously served as Rome, Middle East, and Singapore-based Asia correspondent, as bureau chief in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and as Dubai-based columnist writing on the Greater Middle East. Today, we will be discussing his experience as a correspondent in Ukraine and the events that he witnessed and reported on throughout the first year and a half or so of Russia's war on Ukraine and the ongoing impact that this conflict has on global politics. Let's welcome Yaroslav Trofimov to the show. Well, welcome to the show, Yaroslav. It is fantastic to have you on Madison's Notes. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you about your publication, Our Enemies Will Vanish, but it's just a pleasure to have you here today.
Great to be on the show.
Awesome. I'm curious, before we dive into this really complex conflict and your writing about it, I'm curious, what was the impetus for you to return to Ukraine? You spent a lot of time writing about other conflicts, and you note in your career that you were interested in not getting pigeonholed early on in writing about Ukraine. But then in early 22, you returned and you had this conversation with former President
Poroshenko.
Thank you. Where he told you that the conflict was about to start. And I'm curious, did you have an ear towards that? Or were you returning to Ukraine on other pretenses? And how did you decide to return?
Yeah, well, as you already said, I started off as a journalist in Ukraine long time ago before going to New York to graduate school. I was still the Soviet Union at the time, actually, 1990. And then I spent most of my career as a journalist. I've been working for the Wall Street Journal since the final year of the 20th century, 1999, covering other wars in other people's countries. So I was, for a long time, writing about the Middle East. I was in Baghdad right after the U.S. invasion, 2003. Then I was our bureau chief in Pakistan and Afghanistan. I was living in Kabul for about 5 years. And actually in 2021, I spent most of that year also in Afghanistan because I had to come back to help evacuate some 90 people, our former staff members, current staff members, and their families. Pretty much everyone who has worked for us during the sort of American dominion of Afghanistan. And then it was clear to me, increasingly clear, that clouds were gathering over Ukraine. There was a little twist here because when I was in Kabul in August 2021, and we're desperate to get these people out somewhere, anywhere, because their lives were at stake, there were only two countries that actually helped. One of them was Ukraine. Ukraine agreed to take all of our journalists who had passports. And so the Ukrainians sent a military plane to Kabul with special forces that actually left the airfield and went around, took in many Afghans and brought them to safety in Ukraine, relative safety, I guess. And Mexico was the other country. Mexico took our other employees who did not have passports. So via Qatar, they ended up in Mexico, spent almost a year there before being eventually resettled in Canada and some of them in the US. And so I remember coming back to Ukraine that summer, and we had our improvised Kabul bureau in Kyiv, in the conference room of the Hyatt Hotel. And it was clear that the Ukrainians themselves were doing this in part because they wanted to have as many friends as possible ahead of a war that was becoming more and more likely. And I remember talking to my Afghan friends who were waiting in Ukraine to move on. And they were saying, you know what? Like, I see all those military drills in the building next to where I live. I mean, these people are preparing. And so, obviously, the signals were starker and starker. The U.S. government was gathering intelligence and sharing it. And so, after returning to Afghanistan, spending some time there under the Taliban in the end of 2021, I decided first thing in January just to go to Ukraine and assess the situation. And once I got there, it was pretty clear that things are going to go terribly wrong very soon. And so I stayed.
I'm curious, as a journalist and also as an author of larger works, at what point in the conflict, this is now looking down the line a little bit further than the beginning, at what point did you see the need in yourself to write the book, even though it was an ongoing conflict, wanting to put together something coherent and a little bit more collected than the articles that you were also writing at the time?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's actually a story of two different books, because now we're talking about Our Enemies Will Vanish, which is a nonfiction book about the war, the Russian invasion and Ukraine's War of Independence. But there is another book, a novel called No Country for Love, that will be published in February 2025. But actually, it was written before this one. And so, and I remember being in Kabul in Afghanistan in 2014, when the Russian invasion really began, with the invasion with the annexation of Crimea, with the Russian proxies pouring into the Donbas region, and when the war really came to Ukraine for the first time. And, people didn't pay much attention to it, didn't know much about Ukraine at the time, but it was already a terrible, terrible conflict. 14,000 people died in 2014, 2015, and the world didn't care. And I remember at the time reading the news and looking at reports and being flabbergasted by just how little people understood about Ukraine, its society, its very complex history, its culture, and how a lot of what people did know came through Moscow's eyes, came through this colonial vision, because, people used to, the people who studied that part of the world studied it through Russia. And so a lot of the expertise was also the expertise that used to see Ukrainians through Russian eyes, even though they were not Russians, which was galling to me, because Ukraine does have a very unique history, and it's a big, big place. It's not a tiny nation. It's the second largest nation in Europe by land size. It's larger than France. And so the novel is kind of tells the history of Ukraine through the life of a woman who's model of my grandmother's life in the darkest period of 1930s, 40s, and 50s, which was a time when Ukraine was probably the deadliest place on earth, between the artificial famine, the Holocaust, the war. And I started writing this book in 2014, and I finished writing it in 2021, just before the full-scale invasion. And I remember writing about the scenes of the destruction of Kyiv and Kharkiv and the bombardments during World War II, which were imagined scenes, because obviously, I haven't seen them firsthand. And then just literally a few weeks after I submitted the novel to the publisher, it turned to reality. It was kind of shocking. And so then, as the war unfolded in 2022, I think by September, I realized that there is a book in it, also because of the way memory works. I just started realizing that even the events of 6 months earlier are already fading away. And you have to create this record and the understanding of the texture of what was actually happening, how it was happening, what were people doing, because it's just evaporating in front of your eyes, and memory plays tricks on you.
That's so interesting and harrowing to hear that moments almost after you had written the fictional version, to be encountering those same scenes in Kyiv. I'm curious, thinking about how Russia has played a part in telling the narrative about who the Ukrainian people are. Specifically, I wanted to talk about what happened in Donbas in 2014, because that lays throughout the book, as I was reading, I felt as though it laid an important, like a keystone in understanding how Ukrainians were perhaps thinking about the invasion in 2022. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happened in Donbass 2014, and if it really did play a key role in setting up the expectations or the cultural responses that we saw in the Ukrainian people during the initial and following days of the conflict?
Yeah, I think the relationship with Ukraine and Russia is very complex, and it's a lot less complex now. But it was different in the immediate aftermath of independence. In 1991, when Ukraine seceded from the Soviet Union, basically, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus together signed this agreement that dissolved the Soviet Union. It was bloodless. Ukrainians did not have to fight for independence in 1991. And the Russians didn't really take it very seriously either. And the idea is that two really separate countries took a while to take hold. Also because there had been centuries of Russification in Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainian language had been banned for long stretches of history. Education in Ukrainian was very rare in many parts of Ukraine in the Soviet times. And lots of people had relatives across the border. And so the idea of Russia as an enemy, as a threat to Ukraine, was not universal, not even widespread in Ukraine at the time. I mean, President Zelensky, who's now leading the war of resistance against Russia, was actually working in Moscow as a comedian on Russian state television in 2014. He hosted the morning show New Year 2014 as the Maidan revolution against a Russian-backed president, Yanukovych, was already in full swing in Kyiv for several months. And so in 2014, when Russia decided to inspire basically the secessionist movements in Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, they didn't just try in Donbass. They tried everywhere. They tried in Kharkiv, in Odessa, in Zaporizhia. They had their own thugs, and the Russian intelligence service had worked for a long time to create these groups that would engage in violence and try to subvert local authorities. So the idea of Russia, in the minds of many Ukrainians, especially the older generation, who remembered the youth and the Soviet times, was, it's a prosperous country because Russia, because of oil and gas, has a higher standard of living. So Russia meant higher salaries, higher pensions, stability, return to the good old days. And it had a certain traction, especially so in Donbass, because Donbass is a mining region. The miners used to be the elite of the Soviet Union, and it was economically depressed in 2014. And so there was this a degree of genuine support for Russia at the time. But then what happened? Then the Russians took over Donbass. And people saw that Russia did not mean higher salaries. Russia meant violence, killing, destruction, gangs taking over businesses at gunpoint. And in those 8 years, and between 2014 and 2022, Donbass became really this lab, this exhibit of what the Russian world really means, and meant nothing good. And most people of Donbass, under Russian occupation, voted with their feet. They either left for Europe, left for the rest of Ukraine, they left for Russia proper, but the majority, pretty much everyone who could afford to, were gone by 2022. And I think that is the reason why when the Russians actually invaded places like Kharkiv that were, quite pro-Russian in 2014, they found this near universal resistance because people now knew what Russian rule means.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious because although there was a renewed feeling of Russian resistance, there was still internal conflict for some of those still loyal to Russian forces. And I'm curious, what was impacting the internal conflict that was still found, the lingering parts? Because it did become clear through Donbass that Russian occupation was not going to provide the prosperity that they might have imagined. But it didn't totally squelch it either.
Well, I mean, if you look at the cities in Donbass that have been taken over by the Russians in the past 2.5 years, it's tremendous destruction. You go to this place. I remember going to places like Bakhmut, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, the ruins, and there would still be people there, a small number of people, maybe 5% of the population, who are there waiting for the Russians to come, because to them, they identify with Russia and the Russian world, as Putin calls it. I mean, the other 90%, 95% had gone to the rest of Ukraine. But then you have this footage. So when the Russian soldiers actually occupied the town, there would always be, there's 5 or 10 locals saying, we'll be waiting for you for so long. Thank you for liberating us. And that is sort of a problem of reporting now from Donbass, because we have seen people going to the Russian occupied parts of Donbass and say, well, all the locals there, say they hate the Ukrainian Nazis and love the Russians. Yes, because 2/3 or 3/4 of the locals are gone. Mm-hmm. So you have the self-selecting people there, the only people who stayed there because they actually like the Russians.
And in your experience reporting on so many different conflicts throughout your career, what are some of the themes that you noticed in other conflicts that then were pulling through unexpectedly or expectedly while reporting in Ukraine during this time period?
Well, I think, wars have similarity. There's always the innocent who suffer. There's always, heartbreaking stories of people caught in the conflict. I think one thing that runs through all this situation is that civilians living in countries at peace just cannot imagine how quickly things can go disastrous. And, I remember in Kyiv, the night before the invasion, life was normal. People were not panicking because it's just unimaginable. Tanks would be in our streets, bombs would be falling on our roofs. And this sort of sudden crossover from normalcy to mayhem, this like really thin wall that separates order from chaos. I think people who haven't lived through this don't really appreciate that. I kept thinking about this, from war to war. And I think the other thread is, in wars, people's character really shows up. And people don't know what the character is before they are in trying circumstances. I think the Ukrainians were as surprised as the rest of the world by how they reacted to this war. Because, unless you are faced with life and death choices, unless you actually are in a situation where you have to show your courage, you have no idea how you will behave. You have no idea if you will panic or not.
I want to touch into that because, as you said, the world was surprised at Ukraine's response so quickly and so promptly and so strongly. And being Ukrainian yourself, having spent time there, what were some attributes looking back that might have contributed to this courage that came out so strongly in the Ukrainian people?
So, I actually was pretty confident that Ukraine will not collapse, which is why I stayed in Kyiv. Knowing that there will be an invasion the next day. Part of it because I traveled throughout Eastern Ukraine and just realized that support for the Russians is minimal to nil in places that actually used to have support for Russia back in the day, back in 2014. But also, Ukraine had 8 years of low level of war with the Russians, but still a war. So hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians had fought the Russians, won battles against the Russians in Donbass, and didn't have fear of the Russians. And so you didn't have this panic when the Russians arrived. People said, well, there we go again. Okay, well, we burned their tanks in Donbass in 2014. We can do it again. And so I think there was this, in a way, the initial Russian invasion in 2014 was an inoculation that then allowed the Ukrainians to survive the actual disease when it came.
And was that, I'm just so curious, Putin has this we are all one people thing, and it seemed to be such an enormous mistake on his part to underestimate the character and the prevailing understanding of identity underneath the Ukrainian people. And through your experience, seem to have gained this knowledge just by being there. But what was it that Russia or Putin was missing so strongly about this? Not understanding how much Donbass and other experiences had affected the way that Ukraine would react to this invasion.
Well, this whole idea of Ukrainians not really existing as a separate nation. It's not just Putin. This goes to the core of the Russian national myth, of the Russian national identity, if you will. Because if you look at history, the original state in that part of the world was the Kyiv Rus, founded in Kyiv, by the Vikings, actually, mostly, as most historians would tell you, around the 8th century after Christ. And for several centuries after that, Moscow just didn't exist. There was a swamp and forest. And Moscow only started to rise to prominence, in the 14th, 15th centuries. At the time where what is now Ukraine and Belarus were under part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so as the Moscow Principality and then Tsarate developed, they basically declared themselves to be the heirs of Kyiv and kind of said that, well, actually, our state began in Kyiv, and we just continue this glorious tradition. And so if you accept that Kyiv is the capital of the foreign country, then suddenly half of Russia's history is no longer Russia's history. And therefore, it's very hard for Russians of all stripes to accept the idea that Ukrainians are actually different people. Mm-hmm. Because then their history does not start in the 7th century, it starts in the 15th century. And the foundation of it is kind of gone. And so you had even the most enlightened Russian intellectual and writers were violently against the Ukrainian national idea. Joseph Brodsky, Nobel laureate, he was an American citizen at the time, he wrote a poem when Ukraine became independent that is like really racist and insulting to Ukrainians, saying, I would spit into the Dnieper River, wishing would flow backwards to swallow you, ungrateful. And then he used the sort of the Ukrainian version of the N-word. And Putin just comes from the same tradition. He was expressing a belief that very many Russians, unfortunately, have. And I think a lot of them lost this belief seeing the Ukrainian resistance, because the fact that the Ukrainians are resisting made them think, oh, wait a minute, maybe they're not the same people as we are. And also, the other part of it is that, Putin traveled in Ukraine a little bit. He didn't know it very well back in the Soviet times. But the very fact of being a separate country for 30 years changed so much in the way people think, the way they behave. A whole new generation grew up who didn't have any memory of living under the Russian dominion. Socially, the countries were drifting in different directions. Ukrainians, unlike Russians, had the ability to go to the European Union without a visa, so you could hop on your Ryanair or EasyJet for $29 and fly to Paris or Vienna. So just cultural references became different. So every year, the two countries were drifting more and more apart culturally and socially, which is why Putin thought that the window of opportunity for him was shrinking and he had to strike.
Mm. No, and it seems almost obvious, of course, looking back. Yeah, untenable what happened. From reporting a place that's also in your homeland, you're no stranger to difficult situations, to dangerous encounters. But what were some of the difficulties or differences that came up in this reporting and writing about this conflict versus in some of the others that you've been a part of?
Well, I think I'll start with what was easier. It was easier on several levels because obviously, being from the place, understanding languages, Russian and Ukrainian, to the very intimate, level that every sort of word and the references with it were instantly understandable is an advantage. I think also the moral clarity of this conflict made it easier to cover because if you covered the war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq or the wars in the Middle East, Gaza, or Lebanon, this is not black and white conflicts. There are lots of shades of gray. In Afghanistan, there weren't really any good guys. The Taliban were bad, but a lot of people in the government were also bad, different level, but still, there was corruption. There were atrocities against civilians, etc. So in Ukraine, it was a very clear-cut case. I'm not saying this because I'm from Ukraine, but it's you just look at the evidence. It was an unprovoked invasion by a foreign country, and hardly any Ukrainians sided with the invaders. It's not a civil war. It's the Ukrainians of all stripes, religions, languages. Ukraine has a Jewish president and a Muslim Ministry of Defense right now, coming together to fight against the invader. And so that narrative on a psychological level is sort of easier to work with. Now, I think because I'm from Ukraine and because I felt, in a way, duty-bound to tell the story, because I could tell the story maybe in a more comprehensive way than many others, I think I took a lot more risks than I did in Afghanistan and Iraq. I went much further, and I mean, there's chapters in the book where I'm kind of on patrol behind Russian lines. And so I probably would not have done that in other wars. But it sort of worked out for now, so that's good.
Well, that's very interesting that you say it was almost easier in a lot of ways, both understanding the language and the region and the culture and all of the context that surrounded it, versus in other wars where you were taking you assessed risks differently. Whereas when I was reading this book initially, I thought it would, and imagining myself in a similar scenario, I thought that might be almost more difficult because of the emotional impact of, you describe in your book, seeing the place you would go on dates when you were younger, and seeing the places that you would call home destroyed or mutilated in some way. And so it's interesting that there's
that gives you energy, it gives you anger, and it gives sort of propels you to do things in a way that it's going to feel like I think it's also one of the wars where you felt where you being there and writing about it and reporting about it actually has a material impact on the ground. I remember running to people in Ukraine, people from the US, from Canada, from Europe, who were there as volunteers, as medics, some as soldiers, and asking them, what are you doing here? And they had no connection to Ukraine. They had no Ukrainian origins, and they were telling me, that's because of what we saw on television, what we read in newspapers. We read the stories, we saw the suffering, and we thought that we could not just sit it out and good conscience, and we just wanted to come and help. And, I mean, this is the moment where you realize that, well, you're not taking this risk for nothing, and, it actually does impact what's happening, not just among these volunteers, but also thinking in the capitals. And I think I have this quote in the book from the Ukrainian foreign minister at the time, Dmytro Kuleba, who was saying that usually nations are acting based on self-interest, on sort of realpolitik. But this is a rare case in history where the moral considerations actually drove policy making, where the governments that didn't really want to help Ukraine very much, were afraid of getting involved, actually ended up doing so because the public opinion in the first weeks after the invasion was so outraged, and by the scenes of massacres like Bucha, by the suffering of Ukrainians in general, and the exodus of refugees, that actually compelled these governments to start sending weapons and financial aid and then more weapons to help the Ukrainians defend themselves.
I'm curious, as a journalist and as a writer, then how have you how have you come to balance all of the interplaying needs of both reporting and kind of giving a transparent lens to what's happening, while also experiencing deep personal loss in these situations? It seems like a very difficult, but maybe even symbiotic relationship to have with your work.
And reporters are supposed to be objective.
Yeah.
Objective doesn't mean you don't have thoughts or feelings or emotions. And, covering a civil trial in the U.S. where, this side has this position, that has this position, they may be both right, both wrong, I don't know, giving them a fair shake, is not the same as covering genocide or covering, mass atrocities. Sometimes, there's no two sides to it. And sometimes one side is killing and the other side is being killed. And so we have to make this more calls, and we cannot just be, giving equal time to the victim and the murderer and saying, well, you figure out who's lying, because we have eyes. We can, we can see what's happening. We can see which side is lying, and that's the value of being there and observing it. And so obviously the book, gives away more of my feelings than the journalism in the newspaper. because it's only my name on it and I'm responsible for it. And the novel, even more so, because it's a work of fiction. But I think, you also have, you want to hear what the Russians are saying. And actually the book gives them, explains what was going on the Russian side. And you want to hear what people who support the Russians saying as well. I mean, I have a few voices in the book of people who, kind of collaborate with the Russians and explaining why they did that. So you don't have to be blind on the show to the bad things that the Ukrainians are doing either, because other than from the perspective of a writer, you want to be honest, because if you're not honest, readers will not trust you. But also, from the perspective of Ukraine as a state, the reason for Ukraine's resilience is precisely because it's willing to talk about mistakes and crimes and corruption and other things that undermine it, not sweep it under the rug, and take action, which is the big difference with Russia. I mean, the whole reason for the hollowness of the Russian military is because of this corruption that was hidden and no one talked about.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious because I've had a number of friends or acquaintances who are young, male Russian and of Russian nationality, who in the last few years have they're in the States studying maybe or something like that, and they're trying their darndest to find other opportunities that keep them away from being drafted should they return to Russia. And of course, Russian propaganda internally is very strong, externally as well. And I'm curious if you see from your experience if the Russian military force is going to find a weakness in the individual motivation of its soldiers, based on the reporting that's happening out of Ukraine.
Yeah, I think we're now approaching 3 years of this war. And most of the Russian professional military and most of the Ukrainian professional military that we had at the beginning of the full-scale war is now dead or injured. This is a meat grinder. People are dying by the hundreds every day on both sides of the front line. So many people who wanted to fight cannot fight anymore. And so Russia had mobilized hundreds of thousands in 2022, and then it's been basically emptying out its prisons. Every criminal in Russia, everybody arrested in Russia for any crime from drunk driving to murder is told, well, you can go to prison or you can go to Ukraine. And there are raids all over Russia, and people are offered money because Russia is really desperate for manpower. And a lot of the soldiers are disposable soldiers. They are not expected to survive one or two engagements. They are thought in this human way. They're sent in these human waves to take a position, and out of 10 of them, 2 get there, the others die on the way. These 2 sit there, and then the next wave comes in, and then they take it over, and then they keep moving. And that's how they grindingly advance, very slowly but surely, at a huge, huge cost. I mean, the city of Avdiivka that the Russians took this year, a city that was maybe 30,000 people before the war, I think the Russian losses there are numbered in the tens of thousands of soldiers. And that's the pattern. Ukraine also has a problem. Ukraine has a manpower problem. And Ukraine has an ongoing mobilization. And there are people being picked up in the streets and sometimes sent to the front line with not a lot of training, sometimes with enough training. And there is a lot of Ukrainians who are trying to escape the country as well. It's illegal for Ukrainian fighting-age men to leave the country without permission. But many, many thousands have been smuggled across the border to Poland, to Romania. That's also a fact. People are aware of the fact that if they're sent to the front, the odds of coming out in one piece are not very high in 2 or 3 years if this war keeps going on.
Mm-hmm. Do you imagine yourself writing a second or third volume of this book as the conflict has continued, since you've done such a succinct job in collecting the work for the first year or so within the book? Do you see yourself returning and continuing to report and write on this conflict similarly to the way you did for the first?
Yeah, for sure. I think, now we're sort of, so this book ends with the beginning of the war in Gaza in October 2023. but it really focuses on the very first year of the invasion, which is where most of the front lines were set. If you look at where the front lines are now today, they're not very distant from where they were at the time. So the parameters of the conflict were set then, and then a tremendous cost with lots of human losses. The front was shifted here and there by a small distance usually. But I think once the war ends, and depending on how it ends, it will be a major event reshaping the global balance of power. A defeat of Russia would change it one way, to the benefit of democracies worldwide. A defeat of Ukraine would put the rest of Europe in peril and would be a major triumph for this new axis of authoritarian regimes that is being shaped by this war in Russia, Iran, North Korea, and increasingly China. So yes, there will be things to write about once it ends, for sure.
Since the war on Gaza began, but specifically in Ukraine, what would be some of the larger moments that you would find to be the turning points or the significant pieces for that next iteration of this project?
Well, I think the most important thing is that since the beginning of the war, the U.S. and allies wanted the war in Ukraine to be confined to Ukraine.
Yes,
they were telling Ukrainians, you cannot attack Russia, you have to fight in the battlefield, which basically tied the hands of the Ukrainians behind their backs, because Russia had the ability to strike anywhere in Ukraine, using weapons not just of Russian origin, but also the weapons like missiles from North Korea, the drones from Iran. And Ukraine wasn't, and still isn't, allowed to use long-range weapons against Russia. So Ukraine started improvising with its own, and Ukraine does have a military industry, so they started making naval drones that attacked Russian ports in the Black Sea and reopened Ukrainian ports to international trade, Odessa, which was a major, major achievement. And now they're increasingly using these long-range drones that can go more than 1,000 miles to attack strategic installations inside Russia. Hundreds of drones in one night sometimes, which have had major successes destroying Russian ammunition warehouses, energy facilities, military airfields. And I think there'll be more and more of that. And obviously, Ukraine invaded Russia in the summer of 2024, taking over a chunk of the Kursk region in Russia, taking lots of Russian conscripts prisoner who were then traded back for Ukrainian prisoners of war. So I think the understanding in Ukraine is that the war in Ukraine cannot be won in Ukraine. It has to involve Russia, and can only end when the Russian economy and the Russian people suffer enough to sue for peace. And I think this is the new development and the new strategy on Ukraine's part that is obviously not shared by some of its Western partners that are really risk averse.
Taking in light of the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, Gaza, now Israel and Iran, there's so many different ones to focus on. There's so many different players happening, specifically with the United States. And I'm curious how you see Ukraine continuing to operate towards this goal with the development of conflict within the Middle East.
Yeah, I think there are two layers here. There's a purely practical one. The U.S. is rushing weapons to Israel, and some of these weapons are weapons that Ukraine badly needs but is not getting, including air defense interceptors, for example, artillery, lots of stuff. It's not a full overlap, but there is an overlap. Obviously, the U.S. is protecting Israel from Iranian missiles, shooting them down. It's not doing the same for Ukraine when the Russian missiles coming in. And then there is a broader issue, because the case against Russia and Russia's brutality, and the case for helping Ukraine, as I said earlier, was a very clear moral case in the first year of the war. And it wasn't necessarily bought everywhere in the world. Countries like India or South Africa were at best neutral, but it's still the Europeans and the US were making this case. Mm-hmm. It's a lot harder to make this case after Gaza, after tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians were killed there, by Israel using American weapons, and I think in a lot of the countries of the global South, there is a backlash against the US, which also translates to a backlash against Ukraine. And suddenly Russia, which is waging colonial war, waging the first colonial war of the 21st century, is taking moral high ground and parading itself as a defender of human rights, as is China. And so that's the paradox. It makes Ukraine's position more difficult.
Absolutely. Because of the increased importance of the moral argument of these conflicts, particularly the public sentiment of these conflicts, I'm curious, from your reporting or from your experience, what would be the key takeaway reflections that you would want to impart on people considering these conflicts, not necessarily from a both the historical perspective, but also from a moral or humanitarian perspective?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem people have is selective empathy. Because people have, we're all human, we all have our preconceived notions, our framework, ways of how we think about the world. And, if you are in the Middle East or in Latin America and, you have memories of all the bad things that happened because of decisions by the US government, you're automatically conditioned to think that, well, whoever is friends with Americans is bad and whoever is the enemy is good, so Russia good, Ukraine bad. And vice versa. You have, in many places, including in Ukraine, for example, because of Russia, because Iran is supplying Russia, there was a nearly automatic support for Israel in the beginning of the war. That changed as images, from Gaza started pouring in, and people realized that, well, people walking with their pets and the bundles down the road, to Rafah, kind of look like the people who were walking out of Mariupol. And so, unfortunately, people make decisions not based on, some people, not on the merits of the argument, not based on, the suffering of civilians, but based on their just geopolitical priors. And to them, Palestinians or Ukrainians just sort of pawns in this global game instead of people with agency, with individual dreams, aspirations, and needs, which sort of dehumanizes them.
Yeah, and I think that dehumanization is probably the largest threat that we have in these conflicts.
Oh, yeah, totally. Because, again, I think it's our job as journalists or writers is to humanize and to explain that, what is happening in Ukraine is, it's happening to people, or in Gaza for the matter, or in Afghanistan. It's happening to people who are people just like you, who have the same desire to, live happily, enjoy the holidays, have a dinner with their kids, see their grandson graduate from high school, whatever, and it's not exotic.
Yeah. Well, Yaroslav, this has been a really fantastic conversation. I really appreciate your time and of course, all of the expertise and experience that you bring both in this book and in these answers that you've been able to provide this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes with Yaroslav Trofimov. His book, Our Enemies Will Vanish, is of course available wherever books are sold. And as always, make sure to like and subscribe and send this podcast to a friend or a foe. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.